The communications officer aboard the carrier Akagi handed Admiral Chuichi Nagumo the decoded message with trembling hands. It was May 27, 1942. The order was clear as the Pacific sky above them. Operation MI would proceed as planned. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike the American base at Midway Island, lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into open water, and annihilate them in one decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto himself had designed the operation. It was elegant, complex, perfect, or so they believed. Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship, a man of 55 years carved from sea salt and iron discipline. His weathered face showed nothing as he read the order. But inside, beneath the stoic exterior demanded by Bushido and Japanese naval tradition, satisfaction warmed his chest like sake on a cold night. 6 months earlier, these same carriers had devastated Pearl Harbor. The attack had been surgical, precise, devastating, complete. 8 American battleships sunk or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet crippled. The American battleship force, the very symbol of naval power, reduced to burning wrecks and oil-slicked graves. And Japan had lost only 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 men. It was the most lopsided victory in naval history. Since Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force, had rampaged across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami. Wake Island fell after desperate resistance. Darwin, Australia, was bombed into submission. In the Indian Ocean, British bases at Colombo and Trincomalee were struck. British carriers Hermes and Cornwall were hunted down and sent to the bottom. Everywhere the Kido Butai went, Allied forces scattered or died. The 4 carriers represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, had been converted from a battlecruiser in the 1920s and now displaced 36,500 tons. Her flight deck stretched over 800 feet, longer than 2 football fields laid end to end. She could launch more than 60 aircraft in a single strike. Kaga, converted from a battleship, was even larger, a massive, intimidating ship that seemed indestructible to those who served aboard her. Soryu and Hiryu were newer, purpose-built fleet carriers, fast and deadly, representing the cutting edge of carrier design. Together, these 4 ships carried 248 aircraft. 0 fighters that could outmaneuver anything the Americans possessed. Valdive bombers that struck with devastating accuracy. Kate torpedo bombers armed with the deadly Type 91 torpedo, a weapon that actually worked, unlike the defective American Mark 13 that failed more often than it succeeded. And flying these aircraft were men forged in the fires of war. Pilots who had been flying combat missions since the war in China began in 1937, long before Pearl Harbor. Long before most American pilots had even seen an aircraft carrier. They had flown hundreds of combat hours, faced every imaginable situation, survived when lesser men died. They could land on a pitching carrier deck in complete darkness, in a storm, with battle damage, and make it look routine. Standing on Akagi's bridge as the fleet steamed northeast toward Midway on June 3rd, Nagumo watched flight crews prepare aircraft for the coming battle. The scene below on the flight deck was controlled chaos that looked like choreography. Mechanics in working khakis checked engines, their hands moving with confidence born of thousands of hours. They knew these aircraft intimately, every bolt, every wire, every quirk and temperament. Ordnance teams in distinctive colored vests loaded bombs and torpedoes, using hand signals and mechanical precision to handle payloads that could vaporize them if mishandled. Aircraft directors guided planes into position, their paddles orchestrating a deadly ballet. Everything moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. A well-oiled machine, the pride of the Japanese Empire. What Admiral Nagumo didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 200 miles to the east, in a windowless basement beneath the shattered ruins of Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers had been reading his messages for weeks. They knew Operation MY inside and out. They knew the objective was Midway. They knew he commanded 4 carriers. They knew exactly where he would be and exactly when he would arrive. They even knew the radio frequencies his spotting planes would use. The trap Nagumo thought he was setting wasn't his. It was theirs. And in 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th, 1942, 5 minutes that would live forever in the annals of warfare, the course of the Pacific War and perhaps the entire Second World War would change completely. The unstoppable would be stopped. The invincible would burn. And democracy, armed with intelligence and courage, would prove that free men fighting for their homes could defeat tyranny's finest warriors. This is the story of how it happened. Of codebreakers who never fired a shot but won the battle before it began. Of torpedo pilots who flew to certain death to give their brothers a chance. Of dive bomber pilots who gambled everything on a hunch and 5 minutes of perfect execution. Of young men, American and Japanese, who gave everything they had thousands of miles from home. This is the story of Midway. 6,000 miles from Tokyo, beneath the administration building at Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort worked in a space his team had nicknamed the Dungeon. The basement room had no windows, no ventilation, no natural light. It was filled with the constant clatter of typewriters, the mechanical clicking of calculating machines, and the acrid smell of too many cigarettes smoked by too many exhausted men. Rochefort rarely left. When he did emerge, blinking in the Hawaiian sunlight like a mole surfacing from underground, his staff joked that he'd forgotten what the sun looked like. He wore a smoking jacket and carpet slippers because the basement was perpetually cold, even in Hawaii's tropical heat. Some quirk of ventilation made the dungeon feel like a meat locker. His eyes were perpetually bloodshot from staring at columns of numbers for 18, 20, sometimes 24 hours straight. He survived on coffee, cigarettes, and sheer determination. This was Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, Pacific. And these men, cryptanalysts, linguists, mathematicians, radio operators, were fighting a different kind of war. Not with bombs or torpedoes or bullets, with numbers, patterns, probability, mathematics. Their enemy was invisible but just as deadly as any Japanese battleship. It was a code the Americans called JN-25. The Japanese Navy's main operational code consisted of approximately 45,000 5-digit numbers, each representing a word or phrase. Carrier might be 34,789. Attack might be 12,456. Midway had its own code group. Everything had a number. But it wasn't that simple. For transmission, these 5-digit code groups were super-enciphered using an additive table. Another set of 5-digit numbers was added to the original code groups, creating a new set of seemingly random numbers. Without knowing both the code book and the additive table, the messages were supposed to be unbreakable. Mathematically impossible to decrypt without years of work and computing power that didn't exist in 1942. Breaking JN-25 was supposed to be impossible. Before Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's team had penetrated perhaps 10 to 15% of the code. Just enough to know something big was being planned. Not enough to know what or where. The attack on December 7th had come as a complete, devastating surprise. Rochefort had been at a dinner party when the bombs started falling. He had raced to Pearl Harbor through smoke and chaos, watching the Arizona explode, seeing the harbor turn black with oil and red with blood. He took it personally, deeply personally. The codebreakers had failed. Men had died. Ships had burned. America had been humiliated. Never again. That was Rochefort's vow. Never again would the enemy surprise them. By February 1942, Station Hypo had made breakthrough after breakthrough. The Japanese used their additive tables repetitively. The same tables would be used for weeks or months before being changed. That created patterns, mathematical patterns, and patterns could be analyzed, predicted, exploited. The team developed techniques. Mathematical analysis could strip away the additive layer, revealing the 5-digit code groups beneath. Then, by analyzing hundreds of messages, tracking which code groups appeared in what contexts, messages about fuel always contained certain groups, messages about positions contained others, they could deduce meanings, slowly, painfully, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box. A single message might take hours to decrypt. Most messages could only be partially read, with crucial words remaining mysterious blanks that analysts filled in through context and educated guessing. But piece by piece, message by message, intercept by intercept, a picture emerged. By late April 1942, that picture showed something massive coming. something bigger than anything since Pearl Harbor. The intercepted messages spoke of Operation MI, a major offensive, multiple carrier divisions, battleship support, invasion forces, submarines. It would be the largest Japanese operation since Pearl Harbor. But against what target? The messages referred to the objective only as AF, 2 letters. Everything hinged on identifying AF. Some analysts thought it was Hawaii, a second strike at Pearl Harbor to finish what December 7th had started. Others suggested the Aleutian Islands, or perhaps Samoa, or Fiji. The Japanese had multiple possible objectives, and without knowing which one was AF, the intelligence was useless. Worse than useless, it could lead American forces to the wrong place while the real target burned. "We think AF is Midway," Rochefort told Admiral Chester Nimitz in late May. He stood before the commander of the Pacific Fleet in his rumpled smoking jacket and slippers, unshaved, exhausted, but absolutely certain. "But we need confirmation." Nimitz studied the map on his wall. If Rochefort was right, the Japanese would strike Midway with overwhelming force, hoping to draw out the American carriers and destroy them in open battle. If he was wrong, Nimitz would position his remaining carriers, only 3 operational in the entire Pacific, in the wrong place. The Japanese could strike Hawaii itself, or invade Australia, or cut the supply lines to the Southwest Pacific. The entire American strategy in the Pacific depended on getting this right. The stakes couldn't be higher. Captain Wilfred Jasper Holmes, one of Rochefort's team, had an idea. He approached Rochefort with it late one night, both men running on coffee and adrenaline. "We send a message to Midway by secure undersea cable," Holmes suggested, his voice hoarse from too many cigarettes. "Have them broadcast in the clear, no encryption, that their water purification system has broken down. If AF is really Midway, the Japanese will intercept it and report it to their commanders." Rochefort's bloodshot eyes lit up. It was brilliant, elegant, simple, the kind of solution that seemed obvious only in retrospect. "Do it," he said. On May 20th, Midway transmitted an uncoded message on standard frequencies. "Water purification system breakdown. Freshwater shortage critical. Request immediate resupply." The codebreakers waited, listening, monitoring every Japanese frequency. Within 24 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message from their reconnaissance unit. Decoded, it read, "AF is short on water." There it was. Confirmation. AF was Midway. Rochefort walked into Nimitz's office and laid the intercept on his desk. "It's Midway, sir." "Absolutely certain." Nimitz studied the message. Then he looked up at the exhausted codebreaker and smiled. "When?" "June 4th or 5th. The carriers will approach from the northwest. 4 carriers, 2 battleships, cruisers, destroyers. Admiral Nagumo commanding." Over the next 2 weeks, Station Hypo worked around the clock, extracting every possible detail from Japanese transmissions: the date of the attack, the composition of the striking force, the disposition of supporting elements, invasion transports approaching from the southwest, a diversionary force hitting the Aleutian Islands in the north to draw American attention away, Admiral Yamamoto himself commanding from his flagship, the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier force. They learned which air groups would fly from which carriers. They learned the radio call signs. They even learned that Japanese scout planes would search specific sectors at specific times. On May 24th, Japan introduced a new edition of the JN-25 codebook, temporarily blinding Station Hypo. But by then, the crucial intelligence had already been extracted. Nimitz knew where, when, and in what strength the Japanese would come. Admiral Nimitz called a meeting of his staff. He spread the intelligence before them. Some officers were skeptical. Could they really trust this? Shouldn't they hold forces in reserve in case the intelligence was wrong? What if it was a Japanese deception? Nimitz listened to all the objections. Then he made his decision. "We're going to trust the codebreakers," he said. "Position all 3 carriers northeast of Midway. We'll be waiting when they arrive." It was a gamble. Everything on the line. The entire Pacific Fleet, what remained of it, committed based on decoded messages and mathematical analysis. Democracy, armed with mathematics and courage, had cracked tyranny's secrets. Now came the hard part, springing the trap without the Japanese realizing they'd been compromised. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet raced toward Midway at flank speed, cutting through Pacific swells at 30 knots. Their escort destroyers struggled to keep pace, their bows rising and crashing through the waves, throwing spray high into the air. Behind them, back at Pearl Harbor, something miraculous was happening. USS Yorktown had limped into port on May 27th after the Battle of the Coral Sea. She trailed oil from ruptured fuel tanks. She listed 5 degrees to port from torpedo damage. Her flight deck had a bomb crater big enough to park a truck in. Engineers swarmed over her, assessing the damage, making calculations. 3 months minimum, the chief engineer reported. Maybe longer. The hull damage alone. Admiral Nimitz cut him off. You have 72 hours. Silence. Then, Sir, that's impossible. Make it possible, Nimitz said. We need every carrier we have. 1,400 workers from Pearl Harbor's shipyard swarmed over Yorktown in round-the-clock shifts. Welders worked through the night, their torches creating constellations of sparks that illuminated the dry dock like fireflies. They sealed ruptured hull plates with temporary patches. Electricians rewired damaged systems, sometimes improvising when proper parts weren't available. Carpenters rebuilt shattered structures. Painters didn't bother painting, just get her operational. Some repairs couldn't be completed in time. Workers simply went aboard with Yorktown when she sailed, continuing repairs underway. Cables still trailed over the side as she cleared Pearl Harbor on May 30th, 72 hours after entering dry dock. The miracle of American industrial power and determination, made steel and sent to war. 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese. The Americans were outnumbered. But they had something the Japanese didn't. They knew exactly where their enemy would be. The carriers themselves were floating cities. Enterprise, commissioned in 1938, displaced 25,500 tons fully loaded. She was 824 feet long, nearly 3 football fields. Her hangar deck could hold 90 aircraft. Her crew numbered 2,200 men, but that number barely captured the complexity of a modern carrier. These weren't just sailors and pilots. A carrier required mechanics who could rebuild an engine in the dark, radio operators who could maintain communications across thousands of miles, radar operators learning to use brand new technology that was still half magic, damage control specialists trained to fight fires, seal hull breaches, shore up weakened structures, medical personnel ready to perform surgery in a pitching, rolling ship under combat conditions, cooks feeding thousands, storekeepers managing supplies, ordnance specialists handling bombs and torpedoes that could vaporize the ship if mishandled. A carrier was a self-contained world. It had to be. Once at sea, there was no calling for help, no repair shops, no hospitals, no restaurants. Everything you needed had to be aboard, or you did without. Life aboard was a strange mixture of boredom and terror. Days or weeks of routine steaming. Drills, maintenance, chipping paint, swabbing decks, writing letters home, playing cards, reading months-old newspapers. Then, without warning, battle stations, explosions, fire, men screaming, friends dying. Then, if you survived, back to the routine. It took a certain kind of person to handle that psychological whiplash. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky was 38 years old, ancient by aviator standards, when he took command of Enterprise's Air Group in April 1942. Most carrier pilots were in their early 20s, fresh-faced, eager, immortal in the way only the very young can be immortal. McClusky was different. A 1926 Naval Academy graduate, he had spent 16 years in the Navy before taking this command. He had been a fighter pilot for years, accumulating thousands of hours of flight time. He was methodical, cautious, steady, not the stereotypical hotshot who pulled crazy stunts and buzzed the tower. Some of the younger pilots thought he was too conservative, too careful, too old. But as events would prove, Wade McClusky was exactly the right man for the moment history had prepared for him. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard Hornet. Half Sioux, born on a reservation in South Dakota, Waldron was intense in a way that made people uncomfortable. He didn't make small talk. He didn't joke around. He trained his men relentlessly and accepted nothing less than perfection. When Torpedo 8 formed in 1941, most of his pilots were fresh from flight school. Kids, really. Barely old enough to vote. Waldron looked at them and saw what they couldn't. That war was coming. That they might not have much time. That their lives would depend on how well he trained them now. He worked them harder than any other squadron commander. Navigation drills until they could dead reckon across 1,000 miles of open ocean without error. Gunnery practice until they could hit targets in their sleep. Formation flying until 15 aircraft moved like a single organism. Torpedo tactics, the approach angle, the release point, the escape maneuver. And he never, not once, told them that the TBD Devastator was obsolete. That it was slow, vulnerable. That against Japanese Zeros, a Devastator was a flying coffin. He just trained them harder. In late May, Waldron called his squadron together. He handed each man a piece of paper. On it he had written, "Just a word to let you know I feel we are ready. We have had a very short time to train, and we have worked under the most severe difficulties. But we have truly done the best humanly possible. I actually believe that under these conditions we are the best in the world. My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation. But if we don't, and the worst comes to the worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all." Some pilots read it and felt inspired. Others felt a chill run down their spines. It sounded like a man preparing them for death. Lieutenant Richard Dick Best commanded Bombing Squadron 6, the dive bomber unit aboard Enterprise. Born in Bayonne, New Jersey in 1910, Best was a perfectionist who demanded precision from his pilots and even more from himself. In training, he would practice dive bombing attacks obsessively. The approach had to be perfect, the dive angle exactly 70 degrees, the speed exactly right. Too slow and you're a sitting duck, too fast and you can't aim. The release altitude precise, 2,500 feet, gave you just enough time to pull out without cratering into the ocean or the target. Some pilots found him difficult, demanding, never satisfied, but they respected his skill. When Dick Best dove on a target, his bomb hit, every time. And then there was Norman Jack "Dusty" Kleiss, a lieutenant junior grade in Scouting Squadron 6. Born in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1916, Kleiss had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1938, a 3-year man, graduated early because war was coming and the Navy needed officers. He earned his wings in April 1941 and had been flying combat missions since the Marshall Islands raids in February 1942. He was relatively inexperienced compared to some, just a handful of combat missions, but he was steady, reliable, the kind of pilot who didn't panic, who followed procedures, who could be counted on. On the night of June 3rd, as Enterprise steamed toward the launch point 200 miles northeast of Midway, Kleiss sat in the ready room writing a letter, not to his parents, to Jean, his girlfriend back home. They had met before the war. He wanted to marry her, but war kept getting in the way. He couldn't tell her where he was or what he was about to do. Censorship forbade any operational details. So he just wrote about small things, that he was thinking of her, that he hoped to see her soon, that he loved her. He sealed the envelope, addressed it, and left it with the squadron's mail clerk. If he didn't come back, at least she would know he'd been thinking of her at the end. Then he tried to sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day. Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai was, without exaggeration, the most powerful carrier force ever assembled up to that point in history. The 4 carriers displaced a combined 100,000 tons. They carried 248 aircraft. Escorting them were 2 battleships, Haruna and Kirishima, each mounting 8 14-inch guns capable of hurling a 1,400-pound shell 20 miles. 2 heavy cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, provided additional firepower and reconnaissance. 11 destroyers screened the fleet, ready to intercept submarines or torpedo bombers. It was a fleet that could challenge the entire pre-war U.S. Pacific Fleet and win. But the real strength wasn't the ships. It was the men who flew from their decks. The Japanese Naval Air Arm had been built through years of the most rigorous training imaginable. Pilot candidates underwent selection that made American flight training look easy. Physical fitness tests that eliminated 90% of applicants. Educational requirements. Psychological screening. Then, if you made it through, training that lasted years. Carrier pilots had to master not just flying, but flying in the most demanding conditions imaginable. Night carrier landings, instrument flying, navigation across thousands of miles of featureless ocean, combat tactics, gunnery, bombing, everything. Of 1,500 applicants, perhaps 100 earned their wings. Of those 100, perhaps 50 survived long enough to become truly skilled. By 1942, Japan had perhaps 600 truly elite carrier pilots, men with thousands of hours, veterans of China, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean, men who had faced every possible situation and survived. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter that had shocked the world. The Zero could outmaneuver anything. It could climb faster than American fighters. It had range that seemed impossible, over 1,000 miles with drop tanks, allowing it to escort bombers farther than anyone thought possible. Early in the war, Zeros had achieved kill ratios of 10-1, sometimes 20-1, against Allied fighters. The dive bombers and torpedo bombers were equally formidable. The Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber was fast, accurate, and sturdy. The Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber carried the Type 91 torpedo, a weapon that actually worked. Unlike American torpedoes, which ran too deep or failed to explode or ran in circles, the Japanese torpedo was reliable and deadly. And the carriers themselves were magnificent ships. Akagi, the flagship, had been converted from a battle cruiser. She was fast, 32 knots, and carried over 60 aircraft. Kaga, converted from a battleship, was massive and powerful, if not quite as fast. Soryu and Hiryu were newer, purpose-built fleet carriers, sleek, fast, deadly. Together, these four carriers had struck Pearl Harbor, devastated the American Pacific Fleet, and rampaged across the Pacific for 6 months. They had never tasted defeat. Their crews believed, truly believed, that they were invincible. In 24 hours, that belief would die in fire and explosions visible for 100 miles. Sunrise came to Midway at 5:57 a.m. on June 4, 1942. The sky lightened from black to deep blue to gold. The lagoon reflected clouds like a mirror. It would have been beautiful if 1,500 Marines and Navy personnel weren't manning defensive positions, knowing death was coming from the northwest. 200 miles away, aboard Admiral Nagumo's flagship Akagi, flight operations had begun an hour earlier in pre-dawn darkness. The scene on the flight deck was controlled chaos illuminated by sodium lights that turned everything yellow-orange. Flight deck crews had been working since 3:30 a.m., moving aircraft from the hangar deck to the flight deck via the elevators, spotting them for launch, positioning each plane precisely so it could take off in sequence without collisions, arming them with bombs, Type 97 250-kilogram bombs for the dive bombers, Type 99 800-kilogram bombs for the high-altitude level bombers. At 4:30 a.m., exactly on schedule, the first Zero fighter roared down Akagi's flight deck, trailing blue exhaust flame, and climbed into the darkness. Then another, and another. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga commanded the strike force. 108 aircraft total, 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Kate horizontal bombers, carrying bombs instead of torpedoes for this land attack mission. 36 Zero fighters for escort and strafing. It was a massive strike, more than enough to obliterate Midway's defenses. As the aircraft formed up in the dawn sky, Admiral Nagumo retained his reserve force aboard the carriers, aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, just in case American carriers appeared. Japanese doctrine emphasized flexibility. Always keep a reserve ready to respond to the unexpected. The strike force turned southeast and headed for Midway, flying at 14,000 feet, perfectly organized, invincible. At 5:53 a.m., Midway's radar picked up the incoming raid. A young radar man stared at his scope, not quite believing the size of the formation. Many planes bearing 310, distance 93 miles. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Marines ran to anti-aircraft positions. Every available aircraft scrambled, fighters to intercept. bombers to attack the Japanese fleet before it could launch more strikes. 26 Marine fighters climbed to meet the Japanese formation. F-2A Buffaloes, obsolete aircraft that had been rejected by the Navy as too slow and poorly armed. F-4F Wildcats, better, but still outmatched by Zeros. They bravely climbed to altitude and tore into the Japanese formation, and were slaughtered. The Zeros turned inside them effortlessly, climbed above them, got on their tails, and shot them to pieces. Within 10 minutes, 17 of 26 Marine fighters were shot down. Most of the pilots died. The survivors limped back to Midway, trailing smoke, their aircraft shot full of holes. But they had tried. God, how they had tried. At 6:30 a.m., the Japanese bombers began their attack runs on Midway. The Marines on the ground opened up with everything they had. 5-inch anti-aircraft guns throwing up black bursts of shrapnel. 3-inch guns firing frantically. 50-caliber machine guns stitching tracers across the sky. Some Japanese aircraft fell, trailing fire, cartwheeling into the lagoon. But most pressed through the barrage and dropped their bombs. Explosions rippled across Midway. The powerhouse was hit. Fuel tanks erupted in fireballs. Barracks buildings disintegrated. The hospital took a direct hit, killing wounded men and corpsmen trying to save them. Smoke boiled into the sky, but the Marines fought back with desperate fury. Anti-aircraft fire was so intense that Japanese pilots later reported it was the worst they had ever encountered. Several aircraft were shot down over the target. Others limped back to their carriers with damage that would make landing dangerous or impossible. When the smoke cleared, Midway was battered but operational. The airfield was still functioning. The radio still worked. Most of the anti-aircraft guns were still firing. At 7 a.m., Lieutenant Tominaga radioed back to Nagumo. There is need for a second attack. 5 words that would change history. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, processing Tominaga's message. The first strike had damaged Midway but hadn't destroyed it. A second strike would be necessary to neutralize the base completely. He made his decision at 7:15 a.m. Rearm reserve aircraft with contact fuse bombs for second attack on Midway. Down in the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious, dangerous process, removing torpedoes from Kate bombers, wheeling them on carts to the magazines, bringing up high-explosive bombs, fitting them to the aircraft. It was back-breaking work in the stifling heat of the hangar decks. Dangerous work. One mistake, one spark, and the entire hangar could explode. The crews worked as fast as they could, but torpedoes are heavy, bombs are heavy, and carriers are big. It takes time. Then at 7:28 a.m., a message crackled over the radio that made everyone on Akagi's bridge freeze. 10 surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles, course 150, speed 20 knots. American ships, to the northeast, where there weren't supposed to be any American ships. The Americans were supposed to be at Pearl Harbor, waiting to respond to the Midway attack. The report came from Scout Plane 4 from the cruiser Tone. The plane had launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems. That 30-minute delay was about to cascade into disaster. Nagumo immediately countermanded his previous order. Prepare to attack enemy ships. Rearm with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Down in the hangars, ordnance crews stopped what they were doing. Some aircraft already had their torpedoes removed. Others still had them. Some had bombs loaded. Now they had to reverse everything? The flight decks and hangar decks became cluttered with aircraft, ordnance carts, fuel hoses, and confused, exhausted crew members. At 7:47 a.m., another message from the scout plane. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. The Americans had a carrier out there. Maybe more than one. This changed everything. Japanese doctrine was clear. Carriers were the primary target. Always. They were the only ships that really mattered in Pacific warfare. Battleships were obsolete. Cruisers were supporting units. But carriers had to be destroyed first before they could launch their own strikes. But Nagumo had a nightmare on his hands. Half his aircraft were in the air over Midway, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. The other half were on his carriers in various states of readiness, some armed with torpedoes, some with bombs, some halfway switched between the two. Meanwhile, American aircraft from Midway began attacking the fleet. Outdated Vindicator and Dauntless dive bombers. B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from 20,000 feet. TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. They were brave. They pressed their attacks despite overwhelming odds. But they were also ineffective. The B-17s dropped bombs from so high they couldn't possibly hit a maneuvering ship. Not one bomb found its mark. The torpedo bombers were shot down by Zeros or anti-aircraft fire. The dive bombers missed. But the attacks forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently, turning, zigzagging, making high-speed runs. It disrupted operations, prevented orderly rearming and refueling. Admiral Nagumo faced an impossible choice. Launch immediately with whatever aircraft were ready, a small, uncoordinated strike that violated Japanese doctrine. Or wait to recover the Midway strike force, rearm everything properly, and launch a massive, coordinated attack the way it was supposed to be done. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized the massed, coordinated strike. Throwing small groups of aircraft piecemeal was wasteful, inefficient, dangerous. Better to wait, organize, do it right. At 7:45 a.m., Nagumo made his decision. After recovery operations are completed, the attack force will immediately prepare for anti-ship operations. The attack force will be launched. Land the Midway strike aircraft, rearm everything. Launch one massive, overwhelming strike that would obliterate the American carriers. It was the tactically correct decision based on everything Nagumo knew and every principle he had been taught. It would prove to be the most consequential 30 minutes in naval history. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his 15 Devastators northwest, flying at 1,500 feet beneath a scattered cloud deck. Behind him were 29 men, 15 pilots, 14 radio men gunners. Young men, most barely out of their teens. They had trained for months for this moment. They had lost their fighter escort somewhere in the clouds. Hornets fighters and dive bombers had gone one direction. Waldron, trusting his instincts over the briefed coordinates, had gone another. Now Torpedo 8 flew alone. Waldron had a bad feeling about the briefed intercept coordinates. They didn't match his understanding of how the Japanese operated, how they maneuvered, where they would be. So he made a command decision. He would navigate by dead reckoning and intuition, heading southwest of the briefed course, defying orders, trusting his gut. At 9:20 a.m., his gut proved right. On the horizon, dozens of white wakes appeared, the Japanese fleet, exactly where Waldron thought they would be. "We have sighted the enemy," Waldron radioed to Hornet. His voice was calm, matter of fact, like he was reporting the weather. Then, "We will go in. We won't turn back. God be with us." The Devastators turned toward the Japanese fleet and began their attack run. The TBD Devastator was obsolete before Pearl Harbor. It was slow, painfully slow. Maximum speed of 206 miles per hour. Cruising speed 128 miles per hour. With a torpedo slung under the belly, it could barely manage 100 knots, 115 miles per hour. And for a torpedo run, you had to fly straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. Maintain exact altitude, 100 feet above the water. Maintain exact speed. Fly in a straight line toward the target. Get within 1,000 yards before dropping, or the torpedo wouldn't arm properly. Against Zeros, it was suicide. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol spotted Torpedo 8 immediately. 30 Zeros dove on the formation like hawks stooping on field mice. Ensign George Gay, flying near the rear of the formation, watched in horror as the massacre began. The Zeros were making runs from all directions, he would later recall, his voice still shaking years after the war. They were shooting us to pieces, just ripping us apart. Waldron's plane, the lead aircraft, erupted in flames. The fuel tanks exploded. The aircraft nosed over, trailing fire and smoke, and cartwheeled into the Pacific. Commander Waldron died instantly. His gunner died with him. They were the first. Another Devastator simply exploded in midair, blown to pieces by 20mm cannon fire. Pieces of aircraft, wings, tail section, engine, fluttered down like leaves. The crew never knew what hit them. Then another plane gone, then another. Gay pressed on, weaving desperately, trying to give his gunner a shot at the Zeros. Bob Huntington, his radioman gunner, fired back frantically with his single .30 caliber machine gun. but .30 caliber bullets were mosquito bites against armored aircraft, and Huntington was trying to hit fighters doing 300 miles per hour while he sat in an aircraft doing 100 miles per hour, being thrown around by evasive maneuvers and slipstream. Gay saw a Devastator hit the water at high speed. The impact shattered the aircraft. It skipped once, twice, then nosed under and was gone. No survivors. No time for survivors. Another aircraft staggered, smoking. The pilot clearly hit. It struggled on for a few seconds, then nosed over gently, almost gracefully, and splashed into the ocean. It floated for maybe 10 seconds before sinking. Gay saw a figure in the water, waving or just moving as he drowned. One by one, the Devastators fell. Some burned, trailing smoke and fire before hitting the water and exploding. Others just nosed over and plunged into the sea, vanishing instantly. A few made it close enough to release torpedoes, but the Mark 13 torpedoes either ran too deep or failed to arm, or broached and ran in circles. Not one hit. Not one. Gay's plane was the last. He was close now, so close he could see individual sailors on the carrier Kaga's deck, looking up at him, pointing. Zeros were all around him, their wing guns flashing, tracers streaming past like deadly fireflies. A burst of cannon fire ripped through the cockpit. The instrument panel shattered. Gay felt something hot slam into his left arm, shrapnel or a bullet fragment. Behind him, Huntington's gun went silent. "Huntington!" Gay shouted. No answer. Bob Huntington was dead, slumped over his gun. Gay aimed for Kaga, released his torpedo. It dropped, hit the water, porpoised once, then ran straight. He didn't see if it hit. He pulled up hard, trying to avoid crashing into the carrier's superstructure. As he cleared the ship, a Zero pilot put a burst directly into his cockpit at point-blank range. Bullets shattered the windscreen. Shell fragments hit Gay in the arm again. The controls went mushy. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. Gay's Devastator shuddered, stalled, and fell toward the ocean. He had time for one thought. This is going to hurt. He hit the water at perhaps 80 miles per hour. The impact was like hitting concrete. Gay's head snapped forward, then back. Everything went black. When he came to, seconds, minutes, he didn't know. His plane was sinking. Water was pouring into the cockpit. He could feel it rising, cold and shocking. Some survival instinct took over. He unstrapped, pulled himself up and out of the cockpit, inflated his life vest, and kicked away from the aircraft. Just as he cleared it, the Devastator's tail rose up, pointed at the sky, and slid beneath the waves. Gay looked around. The ocean was empty. No other survivors, no other aircraft, no parachutes, nothing. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated. 15 aircraft, 29 men, all gone in less than 10 minutes. Only George Gay remained, floating alone in the middle of the Pacific, wounded, surrounded by Japanese warships. A destroyer steamed past, so close Gay could smell diesel exhaust and see sailors on deck. He ducked his head under his rubber seat cushion. He'd grabbed it as he evacuated, and held his breath, praying they wouldn't spot him. The destroyer passed. Gay surfaced, gasping, and found himself in the center of the Japanese fleet, carriers maneuvering, battleships, cruisers, destroyers racing back and forth. He was alone, wounded, in enemy-controlled waters. His chances of survival were essentially zero, but he was alive, and from his front-row seat in the middle of the Japanese fleet, George Gay was about to witness something extraordinary. Torpedo 6 from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, found the Japanese fleet at 9:40 a.m. 14 Devastators. Like Torpedo 8, they had lost their fighter escort. Like Torpedo 8, they attacked anyway. The Zeros tore them apart. 10 of 14 aircraft shot down. 36 men killed, including Commander Lindsay. The survivors limped back to Enterprise, their aircraft shot full of holes, some wounded, all traumatized. Not one torpedo hit. Torpedo 3 from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, attacked at 10 a.m., 12 Devastators escorted by 6 Wildcats. The Wildcats tried desperately to protect the torpedo bombers, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. 10 of 12 Devastators were shot down. 20 men killed, including Commander Massey. Not one torpedo hit. 41 American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carriers that morning. 35 were shot down. 87 men died. Not one torpedo hit its target. Not one. But their sacrifice, unknowing, unintentional, but absolutely critical, was not in vain. The torpedo attacks pulled every Japanese fighter down to wave level. The Zeros had spent the last 40 minutes chasing slow, low-flying torpedo bombers. They had expended ammunition. They had burned fuel. When they shot down the last Devastator, they were at sea level, 10 to 15 miles from their carriers, some already approaching to land and rearm. The combat air patrol, the fighter screen that protected the carriers, was gone, chasing torpedo bombers, at sea level. Above, at 19,000 feet, the sky was empty, clear, blue, perfect visibility, and the dive bombers were coming. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky checked his fuel gauge and felt his stomach clench. The needle hovered near half. Not good. Not good at all. He had led his 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers to the calculated intercept point 200 miles northwest of Enterprise. They had arrived at 9:20 a.m., exactly as planned, at exactly the right coordinates intelligence had provided. Empty ocean. No Japanese fleet, no carriers, no wake. Nothing but endless Pacific in every direction. McClusky had circled, burning fuel, searching. His pilots followed in perfect formation, trusting him, saying nothing even as they watched their own fuel gauges drop toward empty. Every minute of circling was a minute of fuel burned. Fuel they would need for the flight back to Enterprise. The Dauntless had a range of about 1,100 miles total, but that was under ideal conditions. Combat operations, climbing to altitude, maneuvering, all of it ate fuel like crazy. And they had already been flying for over 2 hours. The temptation to turn back was overwhelming. The smart play was to return to the carrier now, while they still had enough fuel to make it. Landing in the ocean meant death, either from drowning, exposure, or sharks. Probably all three. But something told McClusky to keep searching. Some instinct, some stubborn refusal to accept failure. At 9:55 a.m., he made a decision. The Japanese were probably further north than intelligence had predicted. They might be heading toward Midway on a slightly different course. If he turned southwest and searched along that bearing, maybe he would find them. It was a calculated gamble. He was betting 33 aircraft and 66 lives on intuition. Behind him, pilots glanced nervously at fuel gauges. Some were already in the red. But no one broke radio silence to complain. No one turned back. They trusted McClusky. 10 minutes passed. 15. 20. The fuel gauge on McClusky's aircraft read dangerously low. Some quick mental math. Maybe 20 minutes of fuel remaining. Probably not enough to get back to Enterprise even if he turned around right now. They were committed. Find the Japanese or ditch in the ocean. Then, at 10:05 a.m., McClusky saw it. A thin white wake on the blue ocean. Arrow straight. Heading northeast at high speed. A destroyer. McClusky's mind raced. A destroyer running at flank speed heading northeast. Why? Where would it be going? Back to the main fleet. It had to be. Maybe it had been detached for some mission, anti-submarine patrol maybe, and was now racing to rejoin the carriers. McClusky made an instant decision. Follow the destroyer. It would lead them to the targets. He waggled his wings, the signal for the formation to follow him, and turned to follow the wake. It was the destroyer, Arashi. She had been detached to hunt the American submarine Nautilus, which had made a torpedo attack earlier and missed. Arashi had spent the last hour trying to sink the sub with depth charges, without success. Now she was racing back to rejoin Admiral Nagumo's carrier force. The Japanese destroyer was, quite literally, leading 33 American dive bombers straight to the heart of the Japanese fleet. For 15 agonizing minutes, McClusky's dive bombers followed that white wake. Fuel gauges dropped below empty. Some aircraft were running on fumes. Pilots did the math. They were not making it back to the carrier. Even if they found the targets, attacked, and survived, they were going to run out of fuel over the ocean. They flew on anyway. Duty over survival. The mission over self-preservation. That's what separated warriors from everyone else. Then, at 10:20 a.m., they appeared. 4 aircraft carriers in 2 groups surrounded by escort ships. White wakes showing they were maneuvering. Dozens of aircraft visible on flight decks. The entire Japanese Kido Butai spread out below like a tactical map come to life. And the sky above them was empty. No fighters at altitude. The combat air patrol was gone. Down low, chasing the last torpedo bombers, or landing to rearm. McClusky couldn't believe his luck. The Japanese carriers were completely exposed, vulnerable, decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. "This is McClusky," he radioed, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Scouting 6, take the carrier on the left. Bombing 6, take the carrier on the right. Attack immediately." This was it. The moment everything, the code breaking, the ambush, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, had been leading to. Dusty Kleiss pushed his stick forward and nosed into his dive. The world tilted. Sky became ground. Ground became sky. The horizon disappeared. There was only the target growing larger in his bomb sight and the roar of wind over his wings. Acceleration was brutal. The heavily loaded Dauntless fell like a meteor, gravity and engine power combining to push the aircraft toward terminal velocity. G-forces pressed Kleiss back into his seat. His flight suit felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Breathing took effort. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock. 18,000 feet, 15,000, 12,000. The carrier below, Kaga, transformed from a toy ship into a massive vessel. Kleiss could see individual aircraft on the deck now, crew members running, anti-aircraft guns swiveling toward him, tracking his dive. Black puffs of flak began bursting around the diving Dauntlesses. Shrapnel rattled against Kleiss's wings like hail on a tin roof. The aircraft shuddered. He held steady, hands firm on the stick, making minute adjustments, centering the target in his bomb sight. He could see the big red circle, the rising sun insignia, painted on Kaga's forward flight deck. Perfect aiming point. Ordnance crews were pushing bombs and torpedoes across the deck on carts. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere like deadly serpents. Aircraft were being rearmed, their bomb bay doors open, ordnance being loaded. One spark, one explosion, and the entire ship would become an inferno. Ahead and below, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher released first. His 500-pound bomb fell away, tumbling, stabilizing, then streaking straight down. It struck near Kaga's island superstructure. The explosion was enormous, a ball of orange fire and black smoke. Bodies were blown into the air like ragdolls. Metal fragments scythed across the deck. At 2,500 feet, Kleiss pressed his release button. He felt the thunk as the bomb dropped free, felt the aircraft leap upward, suddenly 1,000 pounds lighter. He yanked back hard on the stick. 9 Gs crushed him into his seat. His vision tunneled, color draining away, the world going gray, then black around the edges. The Dauntless groaned, wings flexing, metal screaming, on the verge of structural failure. Then he leveled out just 50 feet above the water, racing away from the carnage at full throttle. "Direct hit!" Snowden shouted from the rear seat. "Forward deck. Right on the rising sun. You got her, Mr. Kleiss. You got her." Kleiss banked left to look back. His 500-pound bomb plus 2 small 100-pound incendiary bombs from his wing racks had struck Kaga's bow perfectly, right on the red circle. Fire and smoke boiled up. Explosions rippled across the deck as bombs cooked off. A second later, more bombs hit. Gallagher's bomb aft. Others amidships. Others near the stern. Within 60 seconds, 4 direct hits. Kaga was engulfed in flames from stem to stern, 800 feet of floating hell. Her deck buckled from the heat. Secondary explosions began as bombs and torpedoes detonated. Fuel ignited. Aircraft exploded. Fire raced through the ship like a living thing. A mile away, Lieutenant Dick Best had seen the error as soon as it started developing. Most of the dive bombers, both squadrons, were going for the same carrier. Kaga. But McClusky had assigned Bombing 6 to a different target. Best pulled up early from his dive, waving his arms frantically, trying to signal his squadron to follow him to the assigned target. But in the chaos and radio silence, only 2 pilots saw him. Lieutenants, junior grade, Edwin Kroger and Frederick Weber. 3 planes, against a fleet carrier. Best didn't hesitate. He led his tiny formation toward Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, a mile away from Kaga. The carrier was turning hard, maneuvering violently, anti-aircraft guns blazing. Tracers arced up like deadly fireworks. The 3 Dauntlesses rolled into their dives. 70-degree angle. Perfect textbook dive. Flak filled the sky, black bursts that shook the aircraft even when they didn't hit. Zeros, having landed and taken off again in record time, climbed desperately toward them. Too late, too far, too slow. Best centered his bomb sight on Akagi's flight deck amidships. He could see aircraft spotted for launch, wings folded, fuel hoses connected, ordnance carts positioned beside them. The deck crew had been in the middle of rearming operations when the attack began. They were scrambling now, trying to push aircraft to safety, trying to disconnect fuel lines, trying to do anything to minimize the catastrophe they could see coming. At 2,500 feet, Best released. His 1,000-pound bomb, twice as heavy as Kleiss's, fell perfectly. It struck Akagi just aft of amidships, penetrated the wooden flight deck, crashed through to the hangar deck below, and exploded among armed and fueled aircraft. The secondary explosions were catastrophic. Bombs cooked off in chain reactions. Fuel tanks ruptured, spraying aviation gasoline that ignited instantly. Torpedoes exploded. Fire raced through the hangar bay with hurricane force, consuming everything: aircraft, ordnance, equipment, men. Within 90 seconds of Best's bomb hitting, Akagi was doomed. The flagship of the Kido Butai, the carrier that had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was a burning wreck. Her hangar deck was an inferno. Smoke poured from every opening. Men jumped overboard to escape the flames, choosing the ocean over being burned alive. Kroger and Weber's bombs hit nearby, adding to the devastation. One struck the flight deck forward. Another hit near the stern. 3 planes, 3 bombs, 1 carrier destroyed. Dick Best pulled out of his dive, leveled off, and raced away at full throttle, skimming the wave tops. Behind him, Akagi burned. At exactly 10:22 a.m., as Akagi and Kaga burned out of control, a third strike force appeared overhead. 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie. Leslie had launched from Yorktown an hour earlier. By sheer chance, or perhaps divine intervention, his formation had followed a slightly different course than Enterprise's bombers. Now they arrived at the perfect moment to attack the third Japanese carrier, Soryu. Soryu was desperately trying to launch fighters to defend the fleet. Aircraft were taxiing into position on the flight deck. Deck crews scrambled to clear the deck park. The carrier needed just 5 more minutes to get fighters airborne. She didn't have 5 minutes. Leslie's bombers rolled into their dives. The Japanese, already reeling from the attacks on Kaga and Akagi, tried to respond. Anti-aircraft fire intensified. Zeros turned toward the new threat. But there were too many targets, too much happening too fast. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit Soryu within 60 seconds. One struck the forward elevator, detonating with such force that the massive steel elevator, weighing several tons, was blown completely off its mounts. It cartwheeled through the air like a playing card, spinning end over end, and splashed into the ocean hundreds of yards away. The second bomb penetrated to the hangar deck forward. Like Akagi and Kaga, Soryu was in the middle of rearming operations. The hangar was crowded with aircraft, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel drums. When the American bomb hit, the entire forward hangar bay exploded. The third bomb hit amidships, starting fires that quickly spread. Soryu staggered like a boxer who'd taken a knockout punch. Fire erupted from every opening. Explosions rippled through her hull. The ship listed to starboard as water poured into ruptured compartments below the waterline. George Gay, still floating in the water miles away, watched the 3 carriers burn. "I could see huge columns of smoke rising," he would later say, his voice still shaking when he recounted the story decades after the war. Black smoke going thousands of feet into the air. It was unbelievable, all 3 of them just burning, the entire Japanese striking force, burning. From 10:22 to 10:27 a.m. on June 4, 1942, 5 minutes that would echo through history. 3 Japanese fleet carriers were mortally wounded. Kaga burned from stem to stern. Explosions rippled through her every few seconds as ordnance cooked off. Her crew fought desperately to control the fires, but it was hopeless. The fires were too big, too hot, spreading too fast. Her captain, Jisaku Okada, finally gave the order to abandon ship at 4 p.m. By 7:25 p.m., Kaga rolled over and sank, taking 800 men with her. Akagi burned even more fiercely. The flagship was a floating pyre. Admiral Nagumo had to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara, escorted off his burning flagship by staff officers while sailors and airmen fought fires and died around him. Akagi couldn't be saved. At 10:25 p.m. that night, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into her to prevent capture. She sank at 5 a.m. on June 5th. Soryu had perhaps 20 minutes from the first hit to becoming uninhabitable. The fires were simply too intense, too widespread. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to abandon ship, staying aboard to go down with his vessel. Soryu sank at 7:13 p.m., taking 718 men to the bottom, including her captain. 3 carriers, over 2,000 men, gone in 5 minutes. The tide of the Pacific War had just turned. The battle wasn't over. 1 Japanese carrier still remained operational, and the Americans would pay for their victory. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan would never recover from this morning. Never again would they hold the strategic initiative. Never again would the Kido Butai terrorize the Pacific. 5 minutes. That's all it took to change the world. 1 Japanese carrier remained operational. Hiryu. She had been operating 10 miles north of the other 3 carriers, slightly separated from the main formation. Her captain, Tomeo Kaku, and Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, the carrier division commander, hadn't seen the American dive bomber attack. They only knew their sister ships were burning. Admiral Yamaguchi was the most aggressive officer in the Japanese Navy. Where Nagumo was cautious, methodical, by the book, Yamaguchi was bold, innovative, willing to take risks. He had argued for a more aggressive strategy at Midway. Now, with 3 carriers burning, he was in command. His orders were immediate and uncompromising. Launch all available aircraft. Attack the enemy carriers. Destroy them. At 10:40 a.m., Hiryu began launching her counterstrike. 18 Ichid-3 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. It was a small strike. Hiryu's full complement was much larger, but many aircraft had been in the air during the American attack, and there wasn't time to recover them all before launching. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike force. His orders were simple: find the American carriers and sink them. Revenge for Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The Japanese strike force headed southeast, following the reverse course of the American dive bombers that had attacked their fleet. At 11 a.m., they spotted the American task force. Their target? USS Yorktown. At 12:10 p.m., Yorktown's radar picked up the incoming raid. Many bogies bearing 255, distance 40 miles, closing fast. Yorktown launched every available fighter, F-4F Wildcats scrambling off the deck in emergency launches. She went to general quarters. Damage control teams positioned themselves throughout the ship. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns. The Combat Air Patrol, 12 Wildcats, tore into the Japanese formation 20 miles from the carrier. They shot down several Vals, but the Japanese pressed on, disciplined and determined. At 12:20 p.m., 8 Val dive bombers broke through the fighter screen and began their attack runs on Yorktown. The carrier's anti-aircraft fire was tremendous. 5-inch guns throwing up a curtain of exploding shells. 40mm Bofors guns firing streams of tracers. 20mm Oerlikon guns hammering away. The sky around Yorktown filled with steel and fire. Several Vals were hit. One exploded in midair, another cartwheeled into the ocean trailing fire, but the others pressed through. 3 bombs hit Yorktown in quick succession. The first penetrated deep into the ship, exploding in the uptakes, the ventilation system that carried smoke from the boilers to the smokestacks. The explosion killed dozens of men instantly and filled the engineering spaces with smoke and flame. Boilers shut down. Speed dropped from 30 knots to a crawl. The second bomb hit the flight deck, blowing a crater 10 feet across and starting fires among parked aircraft. The third struck near the island, wrecking the radar equipment and killing or wounding everyone on the signal bridge. Yorktown staggered, dead in the water, burning, listing 3 degrees to port. But her damage control teams were the best in the Navy. They had trained for this. Within minutes, they were fighting fires, sealing compartments, restoring power. The ship's executive officer, Commander Dixie Kiefer, coordinated the effort with calm efficiency. By 1:30 p.m., just 70 minutes after the attack, Yorktown was making 20 knots again. Fires were out. The flight deck was patched. She was recovering aircraft. It was a miracle of damage control, a testament to American training and determination. But Hiryu wasn't finished. At 2:30 p.m., Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same officer who had led the strike on Midway that morning and reported, "There is need for a second attack." Tominaga's aircraft had been damaged over Midway. His fuel tank was holed. He was leaking fuel. He would not have enough to return to the carrier. He led the strike anyway, duty over survival. The Kate torpedo bombers came in low and fast, just 50 feet above the waves. Yorktown's combat air patrol intercepted them, shooting down several. Anti-aircraft fire was murderous. But the Japanese pressed their attacks with samurai determination. 4 torpedoes were launched, 2 hit. The underwater explosions were catastrophic. Massive columns of water erupted alongside Yorktown's hull. The ship shuddered, metal screaming. Lights went out. Power failed. The ship began listing heavily to port, first 5 degrees, then 10, then 15. In the engineering spaces, men fought to keep the ship alive. But seawater was pouring in through ruptured hull plates. Compartments flooded. The list increased to 20 degrees, then 25. At 3 p.m., with the ship listing 26 degrees and in danger of capsizing, Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order he never wanted to give. Abandon ship. The crew went over the side. Destroyers moved in to pick up survivors. Yorktown floated, dead in the water, a ghost ship listing toward death. Lieutenant Tominaga never made it back to Hiryu. His aircraft, leaking fuel throughout the attack, finally ran dry. He ditched in the ocean. Neither he nor his crew were recovered. But even as Yorktown died, she was getting her revenge. Scout planes had located Hiryu. At 3:30 p.m., a strike force began launching from Enterprise. 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, including aircraft that had landed aboard Enterprise from the dying Yorktown. Dusty Kleiss was among them. This would be his second strike of the day. His aircraft had been refueled, rearmed with a fresh 1,000-pound bomb, bullet holes hastily patched with fabric and tape. John Snowden, his gunner, was in sick bay with shrapnel wounds. A fresh gunner, Kleiss never learned his name, climbed into the rear seat. At 5 p.m., the American dive bombers found Hiryu. She was alone except for escorts, racing northwest at flank speed, trying to escape, trying to survive. At 6 p.m., in the golden light of late afternoon, the dive bombers attacked. Kleiss rolled into his dive for the second time that day, the familiar compression as gravity took hold. Hiryu's deck growing larger. Anti-aircraft fire, less intense than in the morning. The crew was exhausted. Many guns were out of ammunition. He centered the target, made minute corrections, held steady, release. His bomb struck Hiryu near the forward elevator. Other bombs followed, 4 direct hits in total, maybe 5. Like her sisters, Hiryu erupted in flames. Explosions rippled through her. Fire raced across her decks. Admiral Yamaguchi, the aggressive, bold commander who had argued for a different strategy, chose to go down with his ship. Captain Kaku chose the same. They stood together on the burning bridge, saluted toward Tokyo and the Emperor, and waited for the end. Hiryu burned through the night, a beacon visible for miles. At 9 a.m. on June 5th, she rolled over and sank. The Kido Butai, the mighty mobile strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, that had struck Pearl Harbor and sent the British Navy fleeing from the Indian Ocean, no longer existed. 4 carriers gone, over 3,000 men dead. Japan's strategic offensive capability destroyed in a single day. The war would continue for 3 more terrible years. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The flight back to Enterprise that evening was a nightmare. The sun was setting, painting the ocean gold and red. Beautiful, deadly. Fuel gauges read empty. Engines sputtered, ran rough, threatened to quit. One by one, aircraft ran out of gas and ditched. Enterprise, this is Baker 3. Engine failure. Ditching. Position. The transmission cut off. Another voice, younger, scared. Enterprise, this is Baker 11. Fuel exhausted. Going in. Tell my mother. Static. Kleiss's engine began missing as Enterprise appeared on the horizon. The fuel gauge needle sat firmly on empty. He had switched to the reserve tank 20 minutes earlier, just a few gallons. That was gone now. The engine coughed, ran smooth, coughed again. "We're not going to make it," the gunner said from the rear. "Yes, we are," Kleiss replied. He wasn't sure he believed it. He entered the landing pattern. The engine quit completely. Silence except for wind over the wings. Dead stick approach. One chance, no second try. Too high. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed. The deck rushed up. Wheels hit hard, bounced. The tailhook caught the number 3 wire. Slam stop. Deck crew were running before the propeller stopped. They pulled Kleiss from the cockpit. He could barely stand. His legs wouldn't hold him after 9 hours of flying in combat. His aircraft had 47 bullet and shrapnel holes. How it had held together was a mystery. Later, mechanics would call it a miracle. 10 aircraft from the morning strike force never made it back. 20 men hit the water, miles from anywhere. Some were recovered by flying boats or submarines over the following days. Some were never found. In the ready room, pilots who had returned gathered for debriefing. The mood was subdued despite the victory. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 6 returned. 35 aircraft lost, 87 men dead. Torpedo 8, 15 aircraft, 29 men. Only George Gay survived. Torpedo 6, 14 aircraft launched, 4 returned, 20 men lost. Torpedo 3, 12 aircraft launched, 2 returned, 20 men lost. Every empty chair in the ready room represented a friend, an academy classmate, a drinking buddy, someone's brother or son or husband. Lieutenant Dick Best appeared, but something was wrong. He was coughing, a deep, racking cough that wouldn't stop. During his dive on Akagi, he had breathed caustic soda fumes from a defective oxygen system. The chemical had burned his lungs. He would fly one more mission, the strike on Hiryu, then be medically grounded. He would never fly combat again. The man who sank Akagi with a single perfect bomb would spend the rest of the war in hospitals, fighting for every breath. Wade McClusky entered, his shoulder bandaged. A 20-millimeter shell had hit him during the attack, shrapnel tearing through his shoulder. He had flown back, landed the aircraft, and only then allowed the wound to be treated. "We got 4 carriers," he told the assembled pilots. "All 4. They're gone." Silence. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in. The applause built until the room thundered with it. They had done it. Against impossible odds, they had destroyed the Japanese carrier force. But the applause felt hollow. Too many empty chairs, too many men who would never hear the cheers. George Gay floated in the Pacific for 30 hours, wounded, exhausted, surrounded by Japanese warships that could have killed him at any moment. He watched the dive bomber attacks from his front row seat in the water, saw Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu burn, watched Hiryu launch her counterattacks, saw American and Japanese aircraft fighting overhead. At night he floated in darkness so complete he couldn't see his own hand. He thought about his squadron mates, Commander Waldron, Huntington, his gunner, all the others, dead. He was the only one left. Sharks circled. He could see their fins in the moonlight. He stayed very still, hoping they would ignore him. On June 5th, a PBY Catalina flying boat spotted him and landed on the open ocean to pick him up. Gay was so weak he could barely climb aboard. They flew him back to Midway, then to Pearl Harbor. He would spend decades speaking about Torpedo 8's sacrifice, writing books, appearing at Navy events, telling anyone who would listen about the men who flew to death so others could live. George Gay died in 1994, age 77. His ashes were scattered at sea where Torpedo 8 went down, rejoining his brothers 52 years later. Over the following days, American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. They sank the heavy cruiser Mikuma and damaged the heavy cruiser Mogami. But the main Japanese force, including Admiral Yamamoto aboard the super battleship Yamato, escaped westward toward Japan. It didn't matter. The strategic victory was complete and irreversible. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers that had taken years to build and couldn't be quickly replaced. Akagi and Kaga were conversions from capital ships, unique vessels. Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built carriers. All 4 were gone. More importantly, Japan had lost the men. Over 3,000 trained sailors and airmen killed, including 110 veteran pilots. These men had years of experience. They understood carrier operations in ways that couldn't be taught in classrooms or simulators. The muscle memory of hundreds of carrier landings. The instinct for when to push an attack and when to break off. The 1,000 small lessons learned from surviving combat. All gone. The Japanese Navy never recovered. Japan started the war with 6 large carriers. After Midway, they had 2 operational. They would build new carriers over the following years. Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, others. But they would never have the pilots to make them effective. Japan's pilot training program could produce perhaps 100 carrier-qualified pilots per year. The Americans, with their vast resources and industrial capacity, were soon producing thousands. The quality gap would never be closed. For America, Midway proved that intelligence could overcome numerical disadvantage. Commander Rochefort's codebreakers at Station Hypo had given Admiral Nimitz the enemy's entire plan. That intelligence allowed Nimitz to position his forces perfectly, to spring an ambush, to achieve surprise despite being outnumbered. Without that intelligence, the battle would have been completely different. The Americans would have been reacting, arriving late, fighting on Japanese terms. They might have lost all 3 carriers. The battle also revealed critical Japanese weaknesses. Yamamoto's plan was too complex, forces scattered across thousands of miles, unable to support each other. The diversionary attack on the Aleutians drew away strength without accomplishing anything meaningful. Radio silence prevented coordination when the plan failed. Most critically, Admiral Nagumo faced impossible decisions. When scouts reported American ships at 7:28 a.m., he was in the middle of rearming for a second Midway strike. His hesitation, the crucial 30 minutes spent deciding whether to launch immediately or wait to recover aircraft and rearm properly, proved fatal. By the time he was ready to launch an anti-ship strike, American dive bombers were already overhead. Yorktown didn't die on June 4th. Her crew had abandoned ship, but the carrier stayed afloat, listing but not sinking. On June 5th, a salvage party went aboard to try to save her. They were making progress, pumping out water, fighting the list, restoring some power, when a Japanese submarine, I-168, found her. On June 6, the submarine fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown. 1 hit the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside assisting salvage operations. Hammond broke in half and sank immediately, killing 80 men. Yorktown finally sank on June 7th. She went down fighting, battered, broken, but still defiant. Of all the ships at Midway, she perhaps deserved the most credit. Repaired in 72 hours when everyone said it was impossible. Hit by 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. Kept fighting. Her aircraft helped sink 3 Japanese carriers. She was the warrior spirit of America-made steel. Admiral Nagumo survived Midway but never recovered psychologically. He was relieved of carrier command and given progressively less important assignments. In July 1944, commanding ground forces on Saipan, he committed suicide as American Marines overran the island. His chief of staff wrote after the war, "At Midway, we learned that our training and tactics were inferior to the Americans." It was a bitter lesson. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida had led the Pearl Harbor attack. At Midway, he was aboard Akagi when the bombs hit. Both ankles were broken by the explosion, but he escaped. He spent the rest of the war in and out of hospitals. After the war, Fuchida became a Christian missionary, promoting reconciliation between Japan and America. He often said, "At Midway, Japan lost the war in 5 minutes. We never recovered." Admiral Yamamoto was killed in April 1943. American codebreakers, again using intelligence, decoded messages about his inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed his plane over Bougainville and shot it down. Yamamoto died in the jungle, still strapped in his seat. After Midway, he had known Japan couldn't win. He reportedly told his staff, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." Wade McClusky recovered from his wound. He received the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway, for following that destroyer, for finding the Japanese fleet, for leading the attack that changed history. He retired as a Rear Admiral in 1956 after serving in Korea. He died in 1976, age 76. For years, his pivotal role at Midway was largely forgotten, overshadowed by others. Only later did historians recognize that his decision to follow Arashi was one of the most consequential tactical decisions in naval history. Dick Best, who sank Akagi with one perfect bomb, was medically retired after Midway. His lungs never recovered from the caustic soda he breathed during his dive. He would spend the rest of his life with breathing problems. He died in 2001, aged 91. He was often called the man who won Midway. Norman Dusty Kleiss survived the war flying 85 combat missions. He was credited with hitting 3 ships at Midway, carriers Kaga and Hiryu, and later the cruiser Mikuma. He received the Navy Cross. He married Jean, the girl he wrote to the night before the battle. They were married for 70 years. Kleiss retired as a captain in 1962. He lived to 100, passing away in 2016, among the last of the Midway dive bomber pilots. In his final years, he often said, "We weren't heroes. The heroes were the torpedo crews who died so we could get through." George Gay became a TWA pilot after the war. He wrote a book, Sole Survivor, about Torpedo 8's sacrifice. He appeared at Navy reunions, speaking about his fallen squadron mates, making sure their story was never forgotten. He died in 1994. His ashes were scattered where Torpedo 8 went down. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his Station Hypo codebreakers received no recognition for years. Their work was so secret that most didn't even know it existed. Rochefort was passed over for promotion, sidelined by Navy politics, forced to retire early. Only decades later, too late for Rochefort, who died in 1976, did the Navy acknowledge that the codebreakers had won the Battle of Midway before the first bomb fell. The 4 Japanese carriers rest on the Pacific bottom in water exceeding 17,000 feet deep. They are war graves, tombs for thousands. In 2019, the research vessel Petrel, funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, located Kaga. She sits upright on the bottom, hull intact, but her flight deck is destroyed, blown apart by the explosions that killed her. Akagi was found nearby, also upright, showing massive fire damage. The images from submersibles are haunting. Massive ships, once the pride of an empire, now silent monuments to men who died doing their duty. Japanese and American flags fly on the research vessel together. Former enemies, now allies, paying respect to the fallen. Midway wasn't won by luck or superior firepower. It was won by intelligence, the code breakers who cracked Japan's secrets, by courage, the torpedo pilots who flew to death to give their brothers a chance, by calculated risk, McClusky following that destroyer when he should have turned back, by human sacrifice, ordinary men doing extraordinary things. The battle proved that wars aren't won by the best equipment or the most experienced warriors. They're won by those who adapt, who seize fleeting opportunities, who sustain terrible losses and continue fighting. The Japanese had better pilots, better fighters, more experience, but the Americans had broken codes, radar, superior damage control, and industrial might that could replace losses tenfold. Most importantly, the Americans had leaders who understood that calculated risks were necessary. Nimitz risked his entire carrier force on potentially wrong intelligence. McClusky risked running out of fuel to find the enemy. Waldron led his squadron to death because the mission required it. The numbers are stark. 3,057 Japanese died at Midway. 362 Americans. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, 1 American. But statistics are just numbers. Each death was a human being with hopes, dreams, fears. People who loved them. Young men who should have seen their grandchildren died in fire and water instead. The Pacific where they fought is unchanged. The coordinates where the carriers sank are just patches of ocean, unmarked except on charts. But we remember. We must remember. Long as free people exist, we must remember Midway and its men. They saved freedom in 5 devastating minutes. 4 carriers, the Imperial Navy's pride, reduced to burning hulks in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. The war's course, nation's fates, freedom's future, decided by dive bomber pilots pressing attacks against impossible odds. That's Midway's legacy. Not just victory, but proof. When tyranny threatens, free people rise. Courage isn't fear's absence, it's action despite it. Sometimes the world's fate rests on a few brave individuals. And ordinary people, Kansas farm boys and South Dakota Sioux and New Jersey perfectionists can do extraordinary things. The dead deserve remembrance. American pilots flying to death protecting freedom. Japanese sailors dying trying to save their burning ships, fighting fires while ammunition exploded around them, staying at their posts when they could have jumped overboard and lived. All brave men, all deserving better than dying young in the Pacific's middle. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Freedom survived, flourished. The Pacific, once a battlefield where hundreds died daily, is now peaceful. Traveled by merchants and tourists, not warships and bombers. Japan and America, bitter enemies who killed each other with savage intensity, are now close allies. Proof that even the worst hatreds can heal. Soon, none will remain who can say, "I was there. I saw Kaga explode. I watched Akagi burn. I dove through flak walls to hit my target." The last voices are fading. Dusty Kleist died in 2016, Dick Best in 2001, Wade McClusky in 1976, George Gay in 1994. But their story endures, must endure, because free people need to know that freedom isn't free. It's purchased with the blood of young men climbing into obsolete torpedo planes, flying to death so others might live, diving through walls of flak to hit targets, giving everything to stop tyranny. That's what Midway did. Stopped tyranny. Saved freedom. Changed history. In 5 world-altering minutes on a clear June morning in 1942, when the world's fate balanced on a knife's edge, American pilots tipped the scales toward freedom. We remember them. We honor them. We tell their story. Because as long as their story is told, they live. And as long as we remember what they did, the code breakers who never fired a shot, the torpedo pilots who never came home, the dive bomber pilots who gambled everything on one perfect dive, we understand what courage really means. We understand what freedom really costs. And we understand that democracy, armed with intelligence and ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things, is Earth's most powerful force. That is the lesson of Midway. That is the legacy. That is why we remember.